As I've mentioned numerous times in just about every video, dyspraxia is something that affects everybody differently, but it affects almost all aspects of our lives in some way. Now, obviously on this channel, I've talked a lot about the physical and the cognitive, as well as the memory and the social impacts that dyspraxia has on our brains and body. But one thing I haven't really touched on too much, and one thing that really needs to be talked about, especially when going forward with this channel, is, well, emotions. Because this is a YouTube channel and I really don't try to bore my audience, I really generalize a lot when it comes to these topics that I talk about. But the problem is with emotions, it's really hard to just generalize them. Simply put, there's so much variance in human behavior and psychology, and the human brain is so complex that there's no way I can encapsulate everybody's experience with emotions in general, even dyspraxics. So this is my own personal view of how dyspraxia has affected my emotions and how it may affect others' emotions, at least based on what I've seen in forums and Discord. But this is by no means a complete exhaustive list of how dyspraxia can and does affect some people's emotions. So one thing that seems like a common thread with all dyspraxia, and is probably the textbook definition of dyspraxia, is the notable lag between when we receive information and when it actually hits our brain. Same for when our brain makes an output and we actually do something. And it's because of that lag that our feelings, our emotions, and our physical input and output are delayed. You can look at my whole channel to see how this affects your physical, cognitive, and even social output. But what a lot of people don't realize is it heavily affects our emotional input and output too. But unlike physical feelings or, social feelings, so to speak, where the thing is sort of immediate and in the moment, emotions always take time to take hold, even in individuals without dyspraxia. And especially when confronted with a very serious situation or a even traumatic situation, one usually either fights, flights, or freezes is essentially the thing. And while I'm not going to talk in depth about the whole freeze process, because Knowing Better did a much better job of describing that, I will say that us as dyspraxics usually tend to have the freeze input. Now, in many ways, dyspraxia does play a part in our aggression, and so we may even be more inclined towards the fight output, as well as those of us who do have comorbidity with ADHD, in which case the impulsivity will also play a role in that aggression. And statistically speaking, dyspraxics do tend to show more signs of aggression when put in really tense scenarios. You see, due to thousands, at least, of years of evolution based on our cognitive deficiencies, flight isn't really something we've really evolved to be strong in. And so usually it turns to fight or freeze. And in many individuals, it's freeze. Although due to the anxiety that comes with dyspraxia, we're already kind of put in survival mode most of the time, with the constant dyspraxia due to the brain taking so much effort to do things. And so because of that, when you put someone who's already in survival mode into a survival situation, they're going to break and do something crazy. But it's also important to keep in mind that many of us are empaths too, and that's another weird emotional thing that we tend to have. It's important to remember that aggression and just anger in general doesn't usually come naturally to most dyspraxics. And many of us are known as extremely empathetic, which I've also brought up a sizable amount of times in my videos. Many of us are prone to constant strain, fatigue, anxiety, and depression simply because of how much our physical symptoms weigh on us on top of our cognitive symptoms. They throw in the social implications, especially if you have it specifically developmental verbal dyspraxia, and well, you end up just kind of being a mess all the time. And when you see another person who's in kind of a crappy situation, you tend to empathize with at least some part of that. It's also important to remember that we may not be specifically anxious about something that's going on in the moment. The anxiety usually just comes from the fact that our brain has been given way too much information. And while 9 times out of 10 it won't end in a meltdown like those with autism spectrum disorder, it still builds up to some really serious paranoid anxiety, and it makes you overthink a lot. It's also important to remember that we do spend a lot of time in our heads, both due to the social isolation and the fact that our brain is just kind of trying to process so much at once. And so we see all the small details and things and tend to overthink, which also leads to the anxiety, which also leads to emotional distress. It's because of this that many of us are usually diagnosed with seasonal affective disorder, or seasonal depression as many people colloquially call it. SAD, or seasonal affective disorder, as I said earlier, is basically showing serious signs of legitimate depression, but only within certain periods of the year, hence the term seasonal. It is not uncommon for many of us to have specific temperature sensitivities. I, for one, actually really love the cold, especially when I got a nice sweater like this. But I'm also kind of sensitive to heat because of it. And because of that, I tend to show more depression in the summer months. And on top of that, the amount of sun that's out and the amount of people that are usually out and about in the summer ends up building up the anxiety and social isolation as well. And so I find myself a little bit more comfortable in the winter. A lot of the lag that also comes with our emotional input and output also leads to symptoms of bipolar depression. And so many of us usually end up getting diagnosed with that too. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth into the whole bipolar depression thing, because I have a whole video dedicated to bipolar in the next week or two. So watch out for that, but just keep that in mind for next week, because that's important. And as I mentioned in my previous video, many neurodevelopmental disorders, especially ADHD, tend to show similar symptoms and signs to various personality disorders. And in many personality disorders, a diagnosis of ADHD, dyspraxia, or autism is usually a part of the differential diagnosis before deciding whether or not somebody has a personality disorder. So it can be kind of scary when you're actually researching and reading up on disorders to talk about on a channel based on psychology, and seeing a whole bunch of things that look like there's something that you may have, but in the end of the day, they're really not. Those are just certain symptoms of dyspraxia or whatever else you may be suffering. And again, I can't push this enough. Never diagnose yourself. You cannot diagnose yourself unless you have the context, especially seeing as how many of these neurodevelopmental disorders do play their roles in certain factors that may lead to a misdiagnosis like that. But it is because of how much dyspraxia weighs on the body, mind, and emotions that many of us do tend to become hypochondriacs to some extent. And hypochondria definitely does weigh on you emotionally. I think the biggest reason why individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders show signs of IBS, GERD, and overactive bladder so commonly is because it's the dyspraxia. Essentially, you have such enhanced feeling or such enhanced, focus on some specific part of your body that you can almost convince yourself that you're sick when you're not. And yeah, that hypochondria is definitely a big thing in individuals with ADHD as well. So when you're in a position where you're anxious, depressed, and almost sick all the time, you end up starting to have a lot more emotional wear and tear as you get older. And this is why many of us do end up really depressed or really cynical later on in life, simply because, in the adult world, you kind of have to be. You see, the thing that many people don't take into consideration when looking at someone with a neurodevelopmental disorder is the fact that they're probably going through a tough time internally more than externally. And while yes, with dyspraxia, there's definitely its external parts as well, and also with autism spectrum disorder, there's also its external parts. The internal parts usually suck just as much, and it makes it really hard. And unlike being a child or a teenager where there is some focus on you because the whole goal of school and of education is to ensure that someone passes and someone learns, in the adult life there's usually not as many people out there to guide you, and if there are, many people will look down on you as someone who requires that kind of guidance. All you have to do is look at my last 3 or 4 videos just to see how much that social stigma weighs on our emotional and psychological health. And it usually ends up leading to many of us just kind of having breakdowns and stuff later on in life, and suffering severe bouts of depression and anxiety when there really shouldn't be. Although a large part of this is on our end too, simply because due to the frequent anxiety and depression, many of us do suffer that kind of paranoia where we kind of believe that everyone's talking about us or everyone's doing such and such behind our back. And in the modern day technological times where social media dictates everything and we have a cancel culture on Twitter, it makes it kind of scary to exist in a world where you're not too perfect and there's nothing you can really do about it. People like to talk and people like to gossip. That's how we evolved as humans to get to the part where we are. It's through our social bonds and through the shit we used to talk. But unfortunately, it's gotten to the point where the shit talking has become a lot more transparent nowadays with social media, and it does have some serious implications on one's future career prospects and just about everything in their future life. And while I'm rarely on Facebook, I know many of my fellow dyspraxics who do regularly use Facebook, and that probably doesn't help your anxiety much, seeing all the shit talking going on in public. But unfortunately, it's not just as simple as deleting your Facebook, because seemingly everybody uses it now. So we kind of have to find a way to suffer through it in order to at least be in the loop, elsewise be just as socially isolated as we were before, except even more so because we're not a part of the in-group. But there are some ways of mitigating the anxiety, depression, and emotional distress that comes with dyspraxia. One of the biggest ones is trying to remember that most people feel the same way you do. Again, it's no secret that social media is making most people depressed and anxious. In fact, the next generation after us millennials, Gen Z, has been showing some of the highest rates of teen suicide thanks to social media. So while that's not really a good thing, just try to remember that you're definitely not alone in being depressed in the modern world or anxious in the modern world. 9 times out of 10, if you think someone's judging you or someone cares that much about what you're doing, then they're probably not, to be honest. No one really focuses so much of their time on another person unless they are interested in said person. And in that case, well, now you got a secret admirer, so it's not really entirely a bad thing. But 9 times out of 10, the focus isn't really on you unless you choose to bring yourself into that focus. And even using Facebook, the news feed goes by so quick and there's so many targeted ads. And even with the cancel culture, it's important to remember that just like there's 15 minutes of fame, there's roughly 15 minutes of shame. And once you're out there for 15 minutes, people are going to forget about you again. See, that's the crazy thing about life, is it always goes on and it always leads us in kind of a wave direction, if that makes sense. We always have downs and we always have ups, and that's just kind of how life works in general. And sometimes we tend to hit really big downs, and we seem to forget sometimes that it will get better. It always does. It just takes time. And if that time seems to go for a while, then it becomes kind of hopeless feeling. But it's also important to remember that yes, you will get back up again. Everybody does. And as depressed and anxious as we all get, it's important to remember that just about everybody feels that way. And, you know, that's where a lot of our empathy comes from too, is when we actually start to see that in other people. Just that other people aren't as transparent about that. our social media and even how we purvey ourselves in the outside world is usually a caricature of who we really are. And when we're at home, we're usually most ourselves, but even the things we post on Facebook, however personal they may be, are usually gross exaggerations of what's actually going on in our lives. And it's because of that that many of us seem to see people as being a lot more luxurious or having a lot more fun than we do, when in all actuality we're just seeing a small part of what makes a person who they are. And 9 times out of 10 they're dealing with just as much depression or anxiety as we are, but they're getting them dopamine hits for posting really cool stuff. And if you're like most people I know, and you follow a lot of depression pages or a lot of meme pages about depression and being socially isolated, it's going to keep you in that mindset if you're seeing it all the time on your news feed. So, while I agree sometimes they can be funny and sometimes they can be comforting, if that's all you're seeing, then it is going to give you somewhat of a negative view of the world around you, because that's all you're seeing it as. And as I always say in my videos, nothing is entirely good or entirely bad. There's always a positive side, even if something seems really negative. And while it seems like dyspraxia and our emotions is just one big clusterfuck of negativity, it's really not. Like I've mentioned before, we have the empathy, and we tend to be some of the most compassionate and deep people. And because of that, even though our friend groups may be small, they're usually a lot closer and tighter knit. And we tend to make friends a little bit easier simply because we can empathize with the situation. And the empathy, on top of the fact that we are able to separate our emotions from the immediate stimulus, allows us to be significantly more objective too, which in turn leads to that air of intelligence that many people tend to paint us with. But this video is taken long enough as it is, and I'm really not trying to stretch it on forever, especially because emotions don't really seem to be the primary focus of dyspraxia, but it just seems to affect them so heavily. But anyway, that's it for this video. I really don't want this video going on any longer than it's already gone. I'm gonna be going into political rants and stuff. So thanks for watching, everyone. I'll have a video on bipolar disorder next week, hopefully, assuming it's not too busy. If it is, then maybe by the end of the month I'll have that video up. But otherwise, thanks for watching, everyone. You guys have a good one.